everyone. So here's my presentation that I presented at the 79th Annual Conference of the Society of Architectural Historians in Mexico City on April 17, 2026. So when in 2023, I began preparing, together with my colleague Helena Čapková from Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto, a book marking the 100th anniversary of the death of the Czech early modern architect Jan Kotěra, I was struck by how many projects he conceived within a relatively short period of time right before the First World War for the region of the so-called Adriatic and the South Slavic lands. Trained at the Vienna Academy under Otto Wagner, Kotěra quickly became one of the leading figures of Czech modern architecture. Throughout his professional life, he never lacked any commissions, whether from the privileged bourgeois or from municipal governments, Czech public institutions, and, until 1914, the Austro-Hungarian state administration. Existing historiography has tended to interpret Kotěra's projects for the Adriatic and South Slavic regions between 1910 and 1912 as incidental undertakings, consisting with the fact that during the period Kotěra was also designing for other countries outside of Czech land, such as Austria, Germany, Italy, and elsewhere. However, attempts to explain the reason behind Kotěra's projects for Grado, Triest, Opatia, Dubrovnik, Cetinje, and Sarajevo suggest that these were more than mere coincidences. Between 1900 and 1912, a number of architects from the Czech lands pursued extensive ambitions, specifically in the Adriatic region. These included both Czech-speaking architects such as Jiří Stybral, Matěj Blecha, and Emil Králíček, and German-speaking ones such as Josef Schulz, Adolf Loos, Wilhelm Jelínek, and Karl Seidl. Their commissions were of a very specific type: spa facilities, spa and recreational buildings, and large-capacity hotels. The locations were largely limited to Baška, Krk, Pula, Dubrovnik, and Opatia, and the investors were almost exclusively Viennese and Czech entrepreneurs. This paper examines what these architectural activities reveal about the relationship between Austrian and Czech elites and the Adriatic and South Slavic regions, and how these asymmetries were translated into forms that reshaped the built environment and infrastructure. Using Jan Kotěra's projects as a case study, it explores the complex relationship between Central European actors and the region. More broadly, it argues that Central European architectural production cannot be understood solely within the national frameworks, but must be situated within overlapping imperial, economic, and cultural networks that structured the region's modernity. The first problem we must confront concerns the relationship between the Czech lands and the Adriatic and South Slavic regions. In his memoirs, an influential politician, František Soukup, describes both as victims of Austrian domination, sharing a common exploiter and thus, in principle, the same interests. How, then, is it possible that Czech architects and the Czech capital were complicit in the Austrian exploitation of the Adriatic and South Slavic territories and cultures? Actually, the geopolitical positioning of the so-called Adriatic and the South Slavic regions before the First World War was subject to rapid change and, from the perspective of Czech interests, might have appeared opaque or difficult to decipher. Let me briefly introduce the individual projects designed by Jan Kotěra for the South Slavic regions and the so-called Adriatic by highlighting only those characteristic features that will help us clarify the central question of this paper. Among the earliest of Jan Kotěra's Adriatic commissions was his 1910 design for a grand hotel in Lovran near Opatia, now in Croatia. Conceived as a large-capacity luxury establishment combining hotel accommodation with a cafe and the concert and theater halls, the project marked a clear departure from the prevailing model of small-scale historic villa tourism that had characterized the area until then. Although the specific investor remains unidentified, the project's scale and program strongly suggest a client embedded in Viennese or Czech entrepreneurial networks active in Adriatic tourism. Kotyara's most ambitious Adriatic undertaking was the Hydrotherapy Institute and Tristina Hotel planned between 1910 and 1911 for the area between Ičići and Ika near Opatija, also Croatia. Commissioned by Croatian physicians Slobodan Marina and Cvjetko Ostojic, who got their training in pulmonary diseases in New York City. Specialist in pulmonary medicine, the project envisioned a comprehensive therapeutic and leisure complex combining medical facilities, hotel accommodation, villas, sports infrastructure such as tennis, petanque, or skittles, and sea baths. A different institutional framework shaped Kotyara's competition entry for a multifunctional spa and social building in Grado, now Italy, around 1911. Designed for a municipal competition, the project proposed a cultural center combining concert halls, restaurants, salons, and bathing facilities. It illustrates how local authorities actively participated in the imperial leisure economy by using monumental architecture to attract investment and visitors. Its abandonment after the First World War reflects the collapse of Grado's role within the Austro-Hungarian resort network. Kotyara came closest to realizing his Adriatic ambitions in his work on the extension of the Hotel Imperial Dubrovnik, which is now also Croatia, between 1911 and 1912. The hotel, originally commissioned by Baron Viktor Kalkberg, president of the Austrian shipping company Österreichischer Lloyd, functioned as a flagship of luxury tourism on the southern Adriatic. Kotyara's task was to expand and modernize the existing structure through annexes, cafes, service wings, and unified facade treatment. Economically, the project was embedded in the infrastructure of maritime transport and allied mobility, linking Dubrovnik directly to Viennese and Bohemian tourist circles. The partial realization of Kotyara's plans before the war underscores both the ambition and the limits of this process. Yet, these leisure-oriented projects were only one facet of a broader engagement that also encompassed infrastructural and institutional architecture, through which imperial economic power was more explicitly organized. Kotyara's design for the Slavia Bank building in Sarajevo between 1911 and 1913, which was actually built, represents a different yet closely related form of imperial engagement. Commissioned by a Czech financial institution operating in Bosnia, the building combined banking facilities with rental apartments and was conceived as a modern urban investment. The project illustrates the role of the Czech capital in the economic exploitation of Bosnia following its annexation by Austria-Hungary in 1878. While Czech political discourse often framed Bosnian territories as fellow victims of imperial domination, Kotyara's bank building materializes Czech participation in the financial colonization of the region, that is, the expansion of banking and credit system controlled by external actors, which subordinated local economies to imperial financial networks. The project thus exposes a fundamental contradiction between nationalistic rhetoric and economic practice within the late Habsburg Empire. A more symbolic dimension of Kotyara's engagement with the South Slavic region is visible in his design for ceremonial chandeliers for the Montenegrin royal court around 1910. Although their realization remains uncertain, their historicist and Art Nouveau vocabulary suggests an attempt to contribute to the visual construction of Montenegrin state identity, following the country's elevation to a kingdom. The commissioner reflects both Montenegro's reliance on foreign expertise to articulate modern sovereignty and the circulation of Central European designers within emerging Balkan states. Kotyara's project for a Tsar's palace in Sofia, prepared for a 1914 competition, represents his most ambitious engagement with monumental state architecture in the region. Intended for the Bulgarian monarchy, the design departed from the neo-Baroque idiom of competing proposals, instead envisioning a semi-public palace complex integrating cultural and ceremonial functions, such as a public museum, such as 3 different churches, etc. The project must be understood within the volatile geopolitical context preceding the First World War, particularly Bulgaria's shifting back and forth with Austria-Hungary during the Balkan Wars. Kotyara's proposal articulated an alternative model of imperial representation grounded in modern monumentalism, yet it proved incompatible with the expectations of the competition and the Bulgarian court, contributing to its marginalization. In contrast to other architects from the Czech lands who, between 1900 and 1912, designed recreational infrastructure primarily for North Italian seaside resorts and for Croatian coastal destinations, then under the rule of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Kotyara went further. In the highly volatile situation immediately preceding and indeed during the First Balkan War between 1912 and 1913, he sought to participate in the construction of the visual sovereign identity of Montenegro and Bulgaria. By the time Kotyara entered the competition for the Royal Palace in Sofia, the Balkan League, comprising Bulgaria, Serbia, and Montenegro, had already been formed to wage war against the Ottoman Empire. Although Austria-Hungary did not formally enter the conflict, it sought to secure an alliance with the Ottoman Empire through the Central Powers. Therefore, Bulgaria became an enemy of Austria-Hungary. Sanja Behun's concept of interpositionality provides a useful framework for interpreting Jan Kotyara's Adriatic and Balkan projects, capturing the condition of actors who occupy both subordinate and dominant positions within overlapping imperial structures. Rather than viewing Czech architects as either victims of Habsburg domination or agents of imperial expansion, interpositionality highlights their operation between these poles in a space of negotiation and contradiction. Kotyara, trained in Vienna and embedded in Austro-Hungarian institutions, yet active within a Czech milieu that framed itself as oppressed, exemplifies this condition. Czech actors could thus critique imperial domination rhetorically, while materially benefiting from its infrastructures and markets. His architectural work should therefore be understood as interpositional practice within imperial modernization. Laura Doyle's concept of inter-imperiality provides a broader framework situating the Adriatic and Balkan regions as contact zones where Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Italian, and emerging national projects intersected. Kotyara's engagements, from tourism infrastructure to financial and representational commissions, materialize these overlapping imperial dynamics, shaped by shifting alliances and asymmetrical flows of capital and expertise. His work reflects participation in a relational imperial field rather than a single imperial system, in which Czech actors navigated between imperial institutions, nationalist aspirations, and capitalist economic models. Together, these frameworks explain how Czech architects could be politically subordinate within the Habsburg Empire, while simultaneously exerting economic and cultural influence in southeastern Europe. The realization of the Slavia Bank in Sarajevo illustrates how architectural production aligned with imperial interests, while unrealized projects reveal the fragility of such inter-imperial conditions. Architecture thus emerges as a contingent outcome of inter-imperial entanglements rather than a stable expression of sovereignty. Viewed through the lens of infrastructuralism, as articulated by Michaela Rubenstein, Bruce Robbins, and Sophie Beale, Kotyara's Adriatic projects functioned as nodes within broader networks of Central European tourism, medical travel, finance, and mobility. Spa complexes in Opatia or Grado were supposed to be not just isolate leisure architectures, but part of a system linking railways, shipping routes, insurance companies, and seasonal labor economics. Similarly, the Slavia Bank in Sarajevo exemplifies financial infrastructure as a stabilizing mechanism of imperial governance, embedding Czech capital serving Czech and Austrian clientele into Bosnia's urban fabric at a moment when the region was strategically crucial for Austria-Hungary. These projects did not simply symbolize imperial power, they operationalized it by making it, these projects did not simply symbolize imperial power, they operationalized it by making imperial circulation routine, desirable, and seemingly apolitical. To conclude, Jan Kotira's Adriatic and Balkan projects were not marginal episodes in an otherwise nationally framed career, but as symptomatic of a broader Central European condition and as structurally embedded in the late imperial order. His work for the region demonstrates how actors within sovereign power could nonetheless shape space through architecture by operating within overlapping imperial systems and by designing the material frameworks that enabled circulation, investment, and governance. These projects show that architectural agency in Central Europe functioned less through symbolic assertion than through infrastructural participation in unstable inter-imperial fields. Their uneven realization underscores the extent to which architectural production depended on momentary geopolitical alignment rather than on national intent or individual ambition. Architecture thus emerges not as an innocent vehicle of modernization, but as a medium through which imperial power was simultaneously negotiated, enacted, and ultimately exposed as contingent. Thank you.